Hi there, everyone. Welcome to this Green Alliance webinar. My name is Chris Venables. I'm Deputy Director of Politics and Partnerships at Green Alliance. Green Alliance, if you don't know us, is a think tank and charity focused on ambitious political leadership for the environment. I'm really delighted today to be hosting and chairing this webinar. All about putting fairness at the heart of climate action. We're going to hear from three amazing speakers who, in very different ways, are looking at the environmental sector, the environmental movement, and thinking and challenging us on how we represent, work with, speak up for, and be alongside communities and people most impacted by climate change and the wider environmental agenda. I should say a little bit about why we're running this webinar, although hopefully it's obvious enough to all of you who've joined this call. Um, uh, and also a little bit around where this fits into our work. I think it's fair to say that although the environmental sector can be a brilliant, warm, and welcoming place, and obviously the issues that we work on really do affect everyone, both here in the UK and globally. I think it's also right to say that it can be an exclusive place. That it is overrepresented by people of certain backgrounds, and that we have not done enough at the pace and scale required to change how we work, to open up our organizations, and to build a more inclusive community. I think that materially impacts our ability to deliver change and to solve the issues that we work on. So that's where we're coming from. Green Alliance has been on its own journey over the last few years, learned lots of lessons, got stuff wrong, got stuff right, and is trying to change how we work, who we work with, and how we operate as an organization. So perhaps we can speak to that a little bit in the Q&A. Yeah, and also I suppose as well as those kind of practical reasons, which have always been there, well, not practical, the other reasons that have always been there, as to why this agenda is important. Waking up this morning to the Today program, and hearing the story from Citizens Advice that there will be 2 million people this year who will be forced to turn their energy meters off. I think the stark reality, that intersection of energy policy, of climate change, and poverty in the UK has never felt more stark than it has over the last 12, 14 months. And I think the conversations around those intersections obviously are very real at the moment. So a bit of housekeeping, that's a little bit of introduction. We've got three speakers, so they're each going to speak in turn a little bit as to their perspective, insights on these issues. We're then going to have a bit of a Q&A, so I would really encourage you to ask questions. Put the questions in the Q&A function rather than the chat. We will look at the chat, but I'll mostly be looking at the Q&A box. Yeah, that's the place that I'll look at the end, and please vote as well. Sometimes it's really helpful to know which questions are kind of rising to the top. There'll be plenty of time for questions, so yeah, please do chuck them in, and hoping to finish on the hour. So yeah, if you'd also like to tweet about the event, please do #GA event. So yeah, I'm now going to introduce Liz Gadd, who works at New Philanthropy Capital. They've been running a project called Everyone's Environment, and yeah, trying to work with the environment sector to to help us do our work better, to share learning and best practice. Really, I'm going to hand over to Liz to talk us through for 5 minutes or so the work that she's doing. And yes, so Liz, over to you.
Thank you, Chris, and absolutely fantastic to be here today talking about this issue. Poverty and fairness are very much at the crux of environmental action in the UK. It's estimated that around 18% of the UK will be experiencing absolute poverty this year, with millions more struggling and keenly feeling the rising cost of living, indeed, as we all are. But there's no two ways about it. For most of the UK, achieving a good standard of living is tough right now. And those are the people, the groups who are going to be most impacted in the UK, either by the environmental crises directly or related policy. In those low-income households, we see disabled people and people from ethnic minority communities disproportionately represented. So they are particularly going to feel the effects of environmental change. Other groups, especially affected because of their health, their stage in life, or where they are most likely to be living, include younger people, older people, those living with long-term health conditions or likely to experience health inequalities. And if you're in one of those groups and living in a low-income household, you're all the more likely to feel the impacts. And whilst representatives of some of these groups, for example, young people, may have a voice on environmental action, the activists are often those who are not the most impacted. And for environmental policy and action to work, it needs to work for all, which is why these underrepresented voices are absolutely vital to success. Those in the charity sector working on social issues already work with the groups who are going to be most affected by our changing environment. They already hold their trust and a keen understanding of their needs. And the environment sector and policy makers must collaborate more with social charities and the people that they work with and for to raise their voices. At MPC, we're coordinating, as Chris says, the Everyone's Environment Programme, which is a coalition of over 50 charities and funders working to raise the voices of those most impacted and to accelerate action on the social impacts of the environmental crises. We are both social and environmental charities and funders, including large established charities like the British Red Cross and the Wildlife Trust, and new smaller charities such as the Working Class Climate Alliance and Greener and Cleaner in Bromley. We're also key infrastructure bodies such as Ekivo, NCVO, SCVO, EFN and Reach Volunteering. And all of us in the sector have a role to play in supporting the environment sector and ensuring that the changes underway and ahead in how we live, how we work, travel, heat our homes, even the food that we eat, are solutions that work for everyone. So far, MPC and partners in the Everyone's Environment Programme have published briefings on how young people, older people, disabled people, people from ethnic minority communities are impacted by the environmental crises. And then separately, we've published findings from conversations with those people about what they would like charities and policymakers to prioritise. I can add the links to the chat in a moment. And we've similar work underway looking at the impact on people in low-income households and people likely to experience health inequalities over the coming months. We're open to new partners joining us all the time and really feel that collaboration is the way forward. The climate and nature crisis is a real and meaningful opportunity to create a fairer, healthier, more sustainable society for all, where we can address historical inequity and injustice at the same time as restoring our natural world. We need to work together to make that a reality.
Thanks, Liz. That's a great overview. And yeah, so much wisdom that you will have there. from doing that quiet behind the scenes work of building a coalition. I look forward to hearing more in the Q&A, and please stack up your questions for Liz there. So next, I'm going to introduce Roger Harding. It's always funny when you read people's bios, and I read Roger's this morning, and I thought, oh my God, Roger's done so much amazing stuff. But he's currently the director of Round Our Way, which is a new organisation working to platform and promote the voices of working class communities in the conversation around climate change. So, but Roger's done lots of amazing, interesting things working for in and with working class groups and in the poverty space more broadly. So, Roger, over to you, and thanks for joining us.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. And thanks to Green Alliance for putting on this webinar on a really important topic. So as Chris says, I'm the director of Round Our Way. We're a relatively new organisation. We've only been operating publicly since January last year. And we're basically a campaign for people impacted by climate change in the UK, particularly people on lower incomes. And we do that by basically highlighting and trying to spread awareness of the number of ways that people are now being impacted by climate change in the UK. And we published a lot of work on how that's impacting food prices, how people on lower incomes are more likely to get flooded, the impact on people during heat waves, and we've even done stuff more recently on how climate change is increasing the number of potholes that people have to drive through, or cycle through around. And in a lot of our work, we're like trying to speak to a lot of the British public, so often in tabloids and on broadcast news. And what we're trying to do as well is trying to get more particularly older working class voices into the climate debate and support people to run campaigns on issues that they care about as well. And my route as Chris says is I've done varied things, but like the sort of core of what I've done in my career is working on things to do with people being on low incomes and campaigning for a lot more change and improvement on that. So I used to work at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and I ran campaigns at Shelter for a long time as well. And the reason for that is, is a personal one, is not wanting to see people have to struggle as much as I saw my mum struggle growing up. And that's what's brought me to climate, is knowing and seeing increasingly that climate change is having and will have a disproportionate impact in the UK on people on lower incomes, and getting really concerned that that's not being talked about enough. And I'm also in my career ended up talking a lot more about my personal experience because of a frustration about how in a lot of political and policy debates there is a strange stereotyping of people of working class people and people with working class backgrounds. And that's also a way into saying, like, working class people and communities are a very diverse bunch, and therefore I can only speak to growing up when I did in my particular corner of the southeast, and can't speak for people who are working class and first generation migrants or people of colour or growing up in the north or whatever else. And I want to see that variety reflected in the conversations that we have about working class communities in the UK. I think on this question that we're talking about today, like part of the sort of blurb introing this talks about, what the climate change sector could potentially do working with the anti-poverty sector. And I think there's, interestingly, a lot of similarities between the two movements and sectors. And I've obviously spent a lot of time working in what we call the anti-poverty sector. And that is that the anti-poverty sector, if we're honest, has also got a similar, maybe not quite as bad, but bad problem in terms of its own internal class diversity. I did a big piece of work when I used to work at Reclaim a couple of years ago, looking at the class diversity in the anti-poverty sector. And it's sadly the case in a lot of big anti-poverty organisations that if you grew up with or have currently a direct experience of poverty, you are less likely to work in that organisation than if you don't. and you're certainly less likely to make it into many of its campaigns, communications, and policy functions, and you're definitely less likely to make it into its senior management. And we sort of know intuitively that that is true of the climate change movement as well. It clearly has a class diversity problem as well as a race diversity problem and as well. And I think that that is important for a few key reasons. One is just clearly just a justice question in of itself. Like I think all of us are worried about that because we should just be worried about it. But I also think it's clearly a political problem as well to get the kind of change that we want to see on climate within the UK. We are going to need a lot of widespread public support. And at the moment, there are a growing number of populists who are fair weather friends to working class communities, who will pick up the concerns of working class communities only when it's a useful stick to beat climate change policy. But not, aren't troubled about, rising lower incomes or job losses or whatever else it may be in other times. And part of the reason that their arguments get traction is that it is too easy to caricature the climate movement at the moment. And the climate movement is vulnerable due to its lack of class and other forms of diversity. And so, that is damaging the chances of success on many of the issues that we care about. But I think we should also care about it as well, is because it makes the climate movement less effective as well. And I think there is good examples of that in the anti-poverty movement as well. Policy tends to be less well designed when the people impacted by it aren't involved in that. I think we all intuitively know that, but there's not enough work on making it happen. When I was at Reclaim, we interviewed a lot of people from working class backgrounds who we interviewed a high proportion of the number of people from working class backgrounds who do work in the anti-poverty sector. And one of their key frustrations is that, one, they felt they often had to hide their class background, but also two, that they felt that a lot of the communications work of anti-poverty organisations wasn't as good as it could be, and crucially wasn't reaching a lot of working class communities because it was speaking in a language that just a lot of working class communities don't use. So to give an example, and there will be lots of climate examples of this, very few people who experience poverty tend to talk about it in terms like poverty. It's just it's an odd phrase to use. People don't ever tend to really use it about themselves. We know that there's lots of research that says that, and yet, it's still the language that we use when talking about it. And there'll be lots of climate examples of that. So I think it'll also just be making us bad campaigners if we don't deal with this. So to sort of wrap up, so we can move on to Nikki and then the conversation. I think it's great that we're having this conversation. I think it's really important in terms of steps that we can take to fix this. Clearly treated seriously, as organisations are really starting to work alongside organisations that are more rooted in what is going on with and for working class communities. But number one, above all of this, think about it as a diversity and inclusion problem as well. We won't, and our organisations won't be able to tackle this unless the organisations are employing top to bottom, from board, senior management and down, people who are either currently working class or come from working class backgrounds who understand many of these problems firsthand. You can monitor the levels of class diversity within your organisation. That's really easy to do. The BBC does it. It publishes it and holds itself publicly accountable to improving it. And there are good steps that you can take to tackle it at all levels. So there's lots of good advice out there, and there's sort of no excuse not to be doing really good work on that.
Thanks, Roger. I appreciate your clarity there on both some of the reasons why we might for effectiveness, but also in and of itself as something that is the right thing to do. I've got lots of questions, but I'm going to save. I've written them all down. I'm going to save them up because I'm now going to introduce. And please do be putting questions into the Q&A. These webinars always fly by. But I'm going to introduce Nikki, who's one of my favorite people in the sector, because I feel like Nikki always says it how it is. So Nikki is the director of campaigning and communities at the Wildlife Trusts. And And yes, I suppose spends a lot of time, I hope this is right, Nikki, kind of working with communities in the trusts across the UK. So I'll hand over to Nikki, who's going to speak to that experience. And thanks for joining, Nikki.
Lovely, thanks, Chris, and thanks to everyone who's invited us today to talk about this, because it really is critical if we're going to smash through the problems that are faced by climate and nature. I'm the Wildlife Trust, work for the Wildlife Trust as their Director of Campaign and Communities, as Chris says, and the beauty of nature is that it is available to everybody if we make it that way. And that's the work that I'm so passionate and positive about doing. So Wildlife Trust, in case you don't know us, 46 separate charities. 47th one is where I work. It's the umbrella one that sits and tries to support everybody. But the beauty of the Wildlife Trust is we all started from a community that wanted to make a difference where they lived. We all came from that battle to make a difference. And the reason we have gone back to our roots is because we're recognizing that the power of community organizing and the skills that come with that opens up those roots and those opportunities again for communities to take control over where they live, what they want to see and how they want to see it. And that starts to solve different problems. And the only way that you can do that is by, as an organization like ours that's been around for a long time, is to get humble. So the most important thing we did was we spent a year in the Wildlife Trust teaching ourselves how to listen. It's a basic thing, but when you've been established for decades, as we have, when you are full of big ideas, big thoughts, great big concepts, intellectual people who can put things into papers that become policies that, quite frankly, people like me battle to get through and actually concentrate long enough, because my brain doesn't stick with that kind of stuff for long enough. It starts to isolate you and you think it's not for me. So we've gone back to understanding how to listen, how to learn from people, and how to deliver alongside them by finding our role and not the way that's been so often done, parachute in to see if you can save or solve. That's absolutely not what we're about when it comes to our community organising work, and in fact our wider work. And it's a cultural commitment that we've made through our strategy that we put together 2 years ago across all of our wildlife trusts. So what we are now doing is sometimes it's called Team Wilder, sometimes it goes called Next Door Nature, depends on which website you're on, because we're all independent and we've got projects. But the main project we've got is a £5 million investment with the thanks of the National Heritage Lottery Fund, for us to put a community organiser into every single wildlife trust. And their role is to just go into communities and ask simple questions. How can we help? What should we be doing? How can we support you? And we door knock, and we don't talk about nature. We talk about, how's your life right now? What are the struggles that you're having? And we work out with people how we can bring some quality and experiences to them that improves their lives, that is relevant from their context and where they are starting from. It's not about us, it's not about our agenda, and it's absolutely not about trying to talk about nature or climate first. It's about where are people's lives right now, because we can help people through conversation, through listening, and through collaboration of solutions of what they want to see where they live, to improve where they live, to improve their lives, make it more palatable in the toughest of times. People have the answers. We've just got to be prepared to listen to them, because they will know what is best for them where they live. So I've got 3 examples I'd like to share with you, which I'm really chuffed about, that we're seeing across the wildlife trusts. And these are completely by us playing a small part, not a big part. And I share these so that you get to hear the voices of the people who are making a difference. So this is not me. I'm just a middleman passing this story on behalf of the people who make these amazing differences themselves. Isles of Scilly, probably you think about that as about being a beautiful place where you go on holiday and it's all sort of holding hands and skipping along the beach. It's actually a really tough island to live on. because of the way that prices have inflated. It's hard to get a job. It's hard to stay there if you're young. And most importantly, there is a real influx of people who are brought in just to work in the tourism industry, and they're not treated great. They're given pretty rough experiences with long working hours, and also working in the agricultural industry. By us employing a community organiser, they started conversations by going to the local pub and finding out how people lived and what were the challenges that they were having. Cutting a long story short, it worked out that the best way that people could introduce each other to being part of a collective community was to do simple things like beach cleans, because everyone cared about what was happening in the environment. Tiny island, everyone could see what was happening in the impacts. Through those beach cleans, it became even more obvious that people wanted to do more together. But the problem for the immigrant community that was on that island was that they only had one day a week to get everything sorted, get themselves clean and smart, because they were supposed to be in the tourism trade, providing service. And so they just couldn't do what they wanted to do. They couldn't start to do that integration. They hadn't got the time. That was the barrier. So our community organizer forged a relationship with a cleaning company. And that cleaning company took everybody's laundry on for them. And by everyone's laundry being done for them, instead of them having to do that, they were then given the space and the time to spend more energy and to enjoy and have fun again by being part of a community that started to care for the environment. And they all shared that thing, which was nature. Nature wasn't the first thing they were coming together for, it was community, but nature became the bond. And through that bond, they're then able to start to have conversations of how they want to take action, do more, and make a difference as a community, not as separate groups of people. It's all about that bonding. Similarly, in Derby, we had children and communities that were really concerned by the vandalism that was happening where they lived. It made them scared to go out. It was affecting where they were living. People were making assumptions about them because of where they lived, and it wasn't their fault. People were using it for fly tipping, so people were coming in, damaging where they lived and leaving again. There was a heavy drug use problem into the area as well, which was making parents afraid for their children. So our community organizer worked with the local Pakistani community and also the working class white community to bring them together to look at what solutions could be used. And they realized everyone's kids went to school. So the kids had a design couple of weeks, designed weird and wonderful and wacky ways that they would want more nature in their lives to be able to bring them together. And they actually worked out ways that that could happen. So by working through local community groups and working with the local council, most importantly, they started to plant up areas. Kids planted up areas. That meant that the areas became respected. They stopped dumping things there because it looked too nice. It looked like gardens. They then got artists involved who did great big murals through the area so that you could see that it was cared for and it was beautiful and it was looked after. And that beauty and love of nature started to come into it. And by teaching people about how loss of nature damages climate, kids started to advocate for what was happening and what should change within their schools and take that home to their parents. What's happened now is we've got a green corridor that links up one park with another, and kids are talking about seeing butterflies again in where they live, and the drug detritus that was having to be cleaned every single day has stopped. The dumping has stopped. I've come from Derby. This is one of the areas that's been a problem for over a decade for the council, and you can find a little video that explains how that's made such a radical change. We also have a place down in Suffolk called The Hive, which works directly with refugee communities. And obviously, because people are stopped and blocked as they come in the country from working or being able to do anything, by people being able to care for a central community space as part of wider issues that are being helping those refugees to be able to settle, it's actually the meditative and supportive way that you can work with nature that is starting to solve some of the problems around mental health and challenges around health in general for people who are trying to settle into this country. Now, what we're doing is we're showing that nature is a solution. And by understanding what nature does for your life and how it enriches your life, without it having to cost you anything, because it's roles like ours that should be there to support communities to be able to make that difference, you can then have those conversations then have those conversations about how climate affects, not at the beginning when you're going, oh my God, I'm trying to feed the kids, but at the point that is appropriate. And actually that conversation will be brought to us. We don't have to take it to them because it's relevant to their lives and their context. And we are there to provide that space to be able to work out solutions together. And that's what we advocate for. And that's what we want to do carrying forward. And I'm really happy to take any questions around that.
Wicked. Thanks, Nikki. I love that. Particularly get humble and listen. I remember you saying that to me sometime last year, and it really stuck. Right, I'm going to invite Roger and Liz to video them, whatever that phrase is, reveal themselves. Yeah, I guess I've got a few questions, which I'll direct at people, but please do jump in as well if you want to answer it. But I suppose yeah, Roger, just thinking about your, I think the project, well, the organization you've set up and the work that Round Our Way is doing feels quite unique in the sector. I'd be kind of fascinated to know how it's landed, and if you felt that people have intuitively understood the importance and value of it, or if that's been a challenge, or how's it been kind of, doing something a bit different and interacting with organizations, many of which have been around for quite a long time.
Yeah, pleasingly, like I feel like, because this is my first climate gig, so yeah, I feel like I've had a nice warm like welcome to the sort of movement from lots of different people and organizations, which is great, and I think also reflective of a lot of people realize that there is quite a significant and growing problem here, and that it could well grow as well, because as I say, those sort of populists who want to sort of sow division on climate issues are going to do much more in this space and try and, as I say, be fair weather friends to working class communities, to sow that kind of division. So I think the welcome's been good. It's been well received, and the bit that I'm really pleased to see is the conversations that we've been having with people who have been impacted by climate change one way or another are really keen to talk more about how they've been impacted, and are really glad that we can help them do that. I get them on the telly, or if they want to speak into people holding power locally or nationally as well, which is great. And we'll maybe come on to this, but like some of the links are really intuitive to people with climate change if the story is told in a straightforward way as well. And climate issues are going to have to battle against, for example, some papers take a different view than some people on this call would do about the importance of climate change and some of the responses to it. But equally, we've not found it like impossible to get coverage in some of those places if we can tell a story that shows really clearly how it is impacting lots of people's lives in a really local, tangible way. So, like, as I say, last week we did a load of work on how climate change is creating many more potholes, which feels mundane, but like if your car is one of the most expensive things you own, if the suspension goes on that, that's going to be you in a whole heap of financial trouble. And we've also spoken to people who are cycling to and from work who've been injured by it. And we've got a message about climate change into pretty much every tabloid you can think of, and lots of local newspapers up and down the country on an issue that we know people really care about and have spoken to us loads about. So I think there's a real wider public and media and social media appetite out there as well, if we can do the kind of work that taps into it.
Yeah, I really enjoy seeing those stories, because I think it makes it real, which I guess is like Nikki, when you were speaking, as someone also who's like less in the policy but does have to engage in the policy and read briefings and reports. I really identified with the feeling of like, I don't quite know what to do with that amount of information, and I've been working on the stuff for quite a long time. So to then be, kind of in just living your everyday life in the places and those amazing examples that you talked about, yeah, it feels like kind of bringing those stories out is just so important. Liz, I might ask you a question, and thanks to everyone in the chat for posting. I will try and make sure that I pick the questions up. If you want a guaranteed answer, I'd stick it in the Q&A just so that I definitely do that. And thanks, Rashim, for your point around response to Roger's point about language. But Liz, I suppose the question I have for you is obviously what you've done is, what NPC have done is to take that view across the sector and try and like pull together learnings. To be frank, swing slightly between yes, we're making progress, and two, are we back where we started? Have we moved on at all? And I've been at Green Alliance 4 years trying to make some movement on this internally here. My sense from talking to other people is that's a feeling that I think lots of us share every now and then, of like, oh, we've done a little small step, but there's still, we haven't. But so I'd be interested in your kind of view on that. Are we moving at the pace? Do you get a sense that the change is kind of happening at the kind of pace and scale which I think kind of lots of us want it to?
We are moving at a pace and scale we've never seen before, both in national and international politics and in our sector ourselves. And the charity sector's moved into an entirely new space over the last 12 to 18 months. The number of social charities and funders now thinking about their role in the environmental movement is massive. The environmental movement coming from the other direction, thinking about how we join up social and environmental issues together. I think where we sometimes all fall into that feeling of, is it one step forward, two steps back sometimes, Chris, is that we've gone as far as we can alone. We're talking about really big systemic issues that need change on multiple fronts, and the only way that we can do that is together. What we have all tended to do in our own ways previously, which is sometimes driven by funding restrictions, is to find ways to take a solution to people rather than start with, as Nikki was saying, the listening, as Roger's been saying, the people who are experiencing the impacts now, they have ideas about solutions. It takes a very different way of thinking and working to be working more with people than doing to people. What we have found in the conversations we've been having over the last year with people affected is everybody cares. And in fact, more than often, the stereotypes suggest they will. We've spoken to tens of older people who are frustrated about the trope of a previous generation having caused the problems and not caring. Many of them see themselves as having spoken about and having potential solutions to some of these challenges that are going unheard. We've spoken to disabled people who have physically struggled to get into meetings like COP, as you probably saw in the press at the time, but equally have ideas from their day-to-day experience of what can be done differently, and so on with different groups. People care, they care more than the stereotypes would suggest, and they want help to act. In order to be able to do that, we need to do more, less doing to, more doing with, less of the we have a heat pump, what will make you implement it, more of a you have challenges heating your house, we need to reduce your bills and carbon emissions, how can we achieve that together? It's a very new way of thinking, and as Nikki says, listening, but that's the way we're going to move forward at the pace and scale we need to.
Thanks, Liz. It gives me a bit of hope, actually. And I do feel the conversation's certainly more live than it used to be. Brilliant. Okay, there's so many questions coming through, so I'm going to try and group them a little bit to make sure that we cover some of the points made. but thank you everyone. Please do keep posting them. So I really like this one from Dave Powell, and I'll just throw this out to the panel. What do you think would be different about the campaigns and asks of climate NGOs? I'm going to say climate and nature NGOs, Dave, if that's okay, given Nikki's on the call. If working class had more people, had more influence in the sector. I guess we've spoken a little bit about some of that, but does anyone want to pick that up? If not, I'll pick on someone. Nikki.
I'm happy to kick us off. Well, for a start, could we speak plain English? That'd help. I have been in the campaigning world for 20 odd years, and it seems a continual battle to not put the policy language into the campaign ask, and then wonder why we haven't got enough people understanding and supporting and being part of it. Exactly as Liz has just said, it's not that people don't care, they just don't understand what we're saying. We don't make sense unless we've had the wonderful wraparound experience that most of us have of existing in our world for the last 10 to 15 years. So without that and all that knowledge, they flit onto something that makes much more sense. And I say they because that's what my mum tells me, and that's what my friends tell me, and that's what my other half tell me. You know, the amount of times my other half will get something come through on his Facebook page or something like that, and he'll go, why are you even bothering with that? It doesn't make any sense. And I'm like, I'm there defending myself on the sofa. You know, this is the situation I find myself in. So, you know, we've got to use plain English. And that's something that, you know, we've really pushed hard on at the Wildlife Trust. And we've got a fantastic EDI lead who just has fought, and we put everything through easy read. And when we've developed our advice and our information, it all has to be able to be read, and it has to be able to be watched, and it has to be bilingual so that it covers off Wales as well. And we look at other languages that are possible. Just think about what it sounds like to somebody else. And, you know, and I think I read a really good paper. There you go, Chris. I do it sometimes. And I read a really good paper, and it said, don't say we need to green travel. Say, how do we want to move around? How do we want to travel? How do we want to eat? How do we want to have fun? They're the kind of opening conversations that you have that you think, yeah, I can answer how to have fun, but I can't answer how do I want to sustainably travel in the future with my family to ensure that I don't have a climate impact. Because then I go, oh, I'm a bad person, aren't I? I'm one of the bad people. And that's what we've got to be careful of. So I'd say that's a good starting point, is let's simplify our language.
Yeah, thanks, Nikki. Yeah, and I kind of really hear you on language as well. And I guess picking up on Hera's point in the chat, which I thanks for saying that, Hera, and I think I guess spoke a little bit just on that comment around kind of not assuming that working class communities are of a particular well, they're very different. Yeah. Anyone else want to come in on that, Roger? On the broad question, how would things be different?
Liz, I think you wanted to come in first, and then I'll jump in after.
Sorry,
yeah, happily build on Nikki's point. Language is a big barrier, and there's too much jargon in all of our sectors within both social and environmental spaces. And at best, this is intimidating for people new to the subsector, whether that's fellow charity workers or whether that's people in communities. At worst, it's a barrier to us understanding each other. And to that point, I highly recommend a couple of reports, Messaging the Moment by Reset Narratives, Heard and the Rubber Republic, and the Potential Energy Coalition's very readable Talk Like a Human report. And coming to your question, Chris, of what would be different if we can speak in plain English and have sensible conversations, is we will get to that more holistic, systemic, joined up way of doing things. We don't need more environmental solutions and social solutions. We need joined up solutions that are good for people and the planet.
Thanks, Liz. Roger.
Yeah, just going to add to that, and yeah, strongly endorse Nikki's point around language. When we, back when I was at Reclaim, did interviews amongst working class people working in the anti-poverty sector, changing the language we use was the #1 issue that pissed people off about working in a space where they didn't feel that they were representative. And so yeah, so I think we'd use much less jargon, be less technocratic. I think we'd think much more about messengers as well as message on this stuff. Of like, I haven't been working climate stuff for long, but I've been already to quite a number of events, meetings, and so on, when there is a lot of debate about framing and which is the best message to use and all the rest of it. And I love that stuff, and I strongly endorse all of that stuff. But it is then odd that there is not as much focus on who is then delivering that message. You can get wrapped up in endless bits around that, and then like the answer always seems to be, policy guy or whatever should be delivering it. And it's like, it doesn't matter how good, no offense, it doesn't matter how good your messaging is and how well researched it is and so on. Like if you're putting some of the wrong people in front of the camera, it's just going to bounce off of people. And if people don't feel that that person relates to what's going on for them in their lives. I think some of like how we do our comms and campaigns on this stuff, one, I think some of the solution stuff would better marry the sort of short-term and immediate with the long-term as well. Because again, if you've got, which partly answers someone else's question, like if life is really tough right now, like your horizons are really shrunk. And like working with the young people at Reclaim, like there's a lot of chat at the time about lots of young people doing stuff on climate activism, and I would regularly have conversations with them the issues they care about, and climate didn't come up that often. And when you ask them about it, it's because they talked about their horizons just being shorter. It just wasn't time to focus on it and have that kind of focal point. But like lots of issues they did care about and others care about are linked to climate. We're just not making those connections to the short and immediate term, both in how we talk about the problem, which is partly what Round Our Way is trying to do, but then also in some of those solutions to go, look, this is how we can help with some immediate relief for you, but then also linking that to the longer term. And then as a final thought, I mean, there's so many different ways I think it would be different. And I think the best starting point would be to ask the people from working class backgrounds in the sector already, and who've been working in it a while, what they think, because that'd be the best source of insight. I think geographically the sector would be quite different. But one other bit that I'd add is, I think as well as being sort of less technocratic in our language, I think weirdly the sector might actually be a bit more moral in its campaigns and comms. So thinking about, for example, how some of the communications around like ULEZ was done, like because too much of it is policy led and technocratic. Like when people were saying, like, I'm really worried about how some people with an old car are going to get penalised here, the comms response typically was a technocratic one of going, well, actually, technically, only a small minority of people are going to be impacted by this. There's like the argument that person was making was a moral one about whether it's right for someone like them about that. They don't care whether that person totals one person or 50,000 people. They care about that one person's case. And like, we should be able to talk about that rather than then swamping it in stats. So I think, it's an odd thing to say, but I think, we get more values and moral based arguments, pleasingly, rather than policy ones.
Thanks, everyone. Great answers. I'm going to pick a few more. There's one that I think speaks to Hera's point and comment in the chat, but also to, I think it was Rasheen, just around obviously what we know from the science on climate and nature is that it's people outside of the UK who will be the hardest impacted. Again, often from often those on the lowest incomes, on the in sites across the world, and I guess speaking to your point, Roger, around populism and around the threats over the coming years, there have been attempts to kind of weaponize that in a way and to kind of like in a way pit people against each other. I'd be interested to hear your reflections, and I think this is kind of what some of the questions were getting at on good ways of navigating that, and how we kind of like find our way through those tricky waters over the coming years. So that's a really difficult question, isn't it? Someone want to jump in, or is it too hard?
We're starting to think about that kind of question more and more within the Everyone's Environment programme. There's every probability that through the election and beyond, we're going to see environmental action become a political wedge issue. And the last thing we want to be is a charity sector, is finding ourselves on different sides of the argument, potentially being played off against each other. So there's some serious thinking to be done about how charities and funders across the different subsectors can amplify each other's messages, and where we can discuss together where we naturally diverge and where there are inevitably going to be tensions, so that we can do that joined up thinking with the people affected, so that by the time the policy potential answers are on the table, we can collectively push back on that and say, well, this is a problem, that is a problem, you need to talk to those people. It really comes down to finding ways for us to work together better.
Thanks, Liz. And I just realised it was Stefan's question around building a sense of fairness internationally. How do we do that? But Roger.
Yeah, I think on that, like, the more that we can talk about and build that like awareness of impacts in the UK, I think weirdly that then helps bridge more of like people understanding it. My other half works on sort of international efforts and often talks about like the thing of, yeah, sure, charity can start at home, it just doesn't have to end there, and therefore it's perfectly possible to sort of start that conversation about what is going on in the UK and then bridge. And I think there's just more routes to sort of international empathy if we can nail some of what we're talking about in the UK as well. So I think helpfully those go side by side. I mean, I think on the politics of it, like, I think a lot of politicians spend a lot of time on the doorstep, and it is often or will be the case versus like some organizations at the moment, that they are more clued into, some of them at least, into what is going on in some working class communities than some of the climate sector, and therefore will be slightly distrustful of what some of the sector is saying, sometimes from understandable bases. So I guess it just comes back to the point of like, it is a problem that the anti-poverty sector really needs to face up to, that if you have an experience of it in your life, you are less likely to work in that sector. And I think it is a problem that the climate sector needs to face up to. If you are more likely to be like, if you have been more likely to experience the impact of climate change, if you are less likely to work in climate organizations, that is going to continue to be a really big problem and weakness for the sector. And there are important things we can do around partnering with different organizations and all the rest of it, but like, nothing is going to get us past that. So the kind of work that Nikki's been talking about, Wildlife Trust doing it internally, is exactly the kind of work that I think we need to be seeing across the sort of the climate sector. Otherwise, it's going to continue to be a big problem and weakness for the campaigning of it.
Brilliant. Okay, thanks everyone. We are slowly running out of time, and I feel like I know this is what everyone says, host chair cliche, but just scratching the surface of some really big questions. But I feel like I've heard so much that I'm taking away, particularly around kind of listening and being humble and meeting people where they're at. There was a question around kind of reaching out versus bringing in, and I think what I'm hearing a lot of here is the importance of both. I think the importance of organizations changing and doing stuff differently. I think that's really shone through, and lots of practical bits of wisdom and insights around how we do our work, and thinking we're more long term around the coalitions that we need to build. Yes, exactly, Duncan. There's still lots of questions in the chat. I'm going to give each of the panelists just a bit of a chance, I suppose, for any kind of final thoughts, kind of responding to those. Obviously, there's a few to Nikki around some practical advice. I suspect Nikki could talk for hours around that. But Nikki, if you want to speak to that or point people in the direction of things, so I'll give you all a chance to any final parting shots, Liz.
I would say take some time to consider your culture. Is your organisation presenting solutions to others or developing solutions with those affected? So my one ask for everyone listening today is to take one practical step immediately after leaving this webinar. Don't let this important discussion be one of those interesting things that then drops off when you return to juggling the myriad of demands of your day job. I'd recommend arranging a time to talk to your senior staff and board of trustees and asking that question about how you're currently putting fairness at the heart of environmental action, how you could collaborate with others to better raise voices and address the needs of those most impacted. Happy to chat further if anybody would like to.
Thanks, Liz. Yeah, and we'll make sure people know how to do that after the call. Nikki.
So I think for me, I think what's really important is openly seek out challenge and don't be defensive, but learn from it. We have actively gone out and found community organisers and employed them so that we're not, just leaning into people and using them, but actually employed people from within communities who then will say to us, you do realise that the way conservation is historically, it's got colonialism wrapped all the way through it, and you've got to address that. And when it's and take that head on and really understand what bad habits are there and look to change those bad habits actively and be informed by other people. That's where the humble comes in. And it doesn't matter whether we've talked to young people, whether we've talked to people of visible ethnic minorities, whether it's working class people, everyone always says the same. Don't be defensive. We're here to help. We're here to support if you'll listen. And as Liz and Roger have said, in that way, you then start to form a unity and a respect. Because the other thing is we talk about wanting to move fast and wanting to do things quickly. Well, we're now realizing that relationships and trust is critical, and you earn trust. You do not get given it.
Thanks, Nikki. Roger.
Yeah, I, like everyone else, could happily talk about this a lot more, including with all the people in the chat. So yeah, I guess a couple of final thoughts of one, around the way we're happy to work with others where we can and where that's helpful. So please get in touch. Two, I think, as I mentioned at the start, there is, particularly in media and political debate, a real tendency to treat working class communities like some big homogenous lump. And we need to really resist that. And there is one working class point of view or anything like it, because it is the most diverse group of people in the UK with a whole range of different experiences and points of view on it. I think, but the point, I guess the final point I just leave people with of important to talk about this, have a go at it, and so on. And I think one watch out. I've sometimes seen well-meaning work in this area slightly trip up by being well-meaning, but just not fully considering how some stuff could come across. So I think one thing to think about is just basically ask yourself the question, would it feel weird if I did this in another context or on another issue? So for example, if someone like me ran or created a campaign on women's equality, I think people would slightly raise eyebrows at that, but I'd be willing to go along with me for a bit. But if I said the main way I'm going to involve women is, don't worry, I'm not really going to employ any, but I am going to set up a special advisory group of people with a lived experience of being a woman as my main input from that experience on it, we would think that was odd and weird. And I think it's important to do that similarly on low income and class issues as well, of just constantly using those simple parallels to go, well, would we do that on other issues, and just basically avoid you stepping into some needless mistakes on some of it and making this a genuine effort, partnership, inclusive piece of work.
Thanks, Roger, and thanks everyone. Thank you for joining. Thanks for being so active in the chat. Clearly, such a live, rich conversation. One we'll we will keep trying to hold space for. Please obviously send feedback on this to us. We won't be defensive. We'd love to know how we got it, how we could do it differently, if more is good, if less is good, and all of that. So yeah, I will just leave it there because it's 1 o'clock. But thanks so much to Roger, to Liz, and to Nikki for amazing insights. And yeah, please do get in touch afterwards if you've got questions or you want to be linked to any of the folks. Although I think they very kindly will put their email addresses in the chat, so you can follow up with them that way. But thanks all. See you again.